All right, so now we're going to go through the 6 principles of the United States Constitution. And again, remember, these aren't necessarily printed within or written within the Constitution, but these are the concepts that continually show themselves throughout the document. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty, as if you remember the vocabulary term from before, sovereignty, which means it is the power given to an individual or to a group of people to make those key decisions. Popular sovereignty, popular meaning people, so it's people hold the power. So as you can see, the people hold the ultimate authority within our country. Now, many people do argue that people no longer have it, that a group of businessmen or a group of professors or whoever it might be hold the key power, but the reality is in our system we still do, because in a civic society citizens still have the ability to vote members of government out. Now, within a representative democracy, remember that's an indirect democracy, meaning that people choose leaders that ultimately make decisions for them. And for example, in Indiana, we have 2 senators and we have 9 representatives. Those 9 representatives come from 9 different districts within Indiana. If you live essentially within 465, then your representative is Andre Carson, who's a Democrat. If you live just outside of 465, like east towards Geist, then more than likely your representative is Representative Susan Brooks, who's a Republican. But Indiana does have 9 representatives, so in total we have 11 electors who ultimately represent us in Washington, D.C. Another key concept here is limited government. The framers really wanted to guard against tyranny or absolute power, and so one of the things that they did is to incorporate within the document is they limited very, very concretely the powers that each branch has. For example, we've already talked about Congress has the power to coin money. The executive branch cannot make money. The executive branch cannot change the money. Ultimately, that power comes from Congress or the legislative branch. So government is limited to the power given to them in the Constitution. Now, some political scholars like to argue that the executive branch has really carved out, a wide array of powers, but the reality is they're still limited in how far they can go. The Constitution tells leaders, if you overstep, you can be removed. And we see President Richard Nixon, who served from 1968 until 1974, where he resigned before he was to be impeached. And actually Bill Clinton, who served 1992 to 2000, he was impeached. We had one other president, Andrew Johnson, who was impeached as well. And we'll learn later on that impeached it's bad, but it's not what most people think. Impeached does not mean convicted. Impeached just means that there's enough evidence to go to trial. So let's move on. The third concept I'd like to talk about is federalism. Now, this is kind of difficult to understand, but federalism is the division of power between the state and the national governments. Some powers are shared, some powers are not. Some powers are reserved just to the states. Some powers are exclusive to the national government. So, it's important to understand that there's kind of a hierarchy within our system. Understand that the national government has the supreme power, and that's through the Supremacy Clause. Now, within federalism, what we see here is I'm kind of a visual learner, and what I always have to kind of place it in sort of a visual context. And so what I like to do is I like to think in terms of that the national government So this is kind of like a vertical hierarchy. And so what we see is that there's a national government. They're responsible for the nation as a whole. There's a state government that is responsible just for the particular state. And then there is a local government that would be responsible for example, Indianapolis or Lawrence. Now, the local government only receives its power from the state. The state can't operate outside of the national government. However, one of the things that we do want to identify here is that, each level of government has certain responsibilities. So at the national government, what we definitely see is like the national government is responsible for defense. It would be illogical for the state to have its own army. Ohio's threatening us, so we're going to invade Ohio. That doesn't work. The national government is responsible for printing money. The national government is responsible for declaring war. We wouldn't want the state of Indiana the power to declare war on Taiwan or Canada, for that matter. The state has certain responsibilities, and this is given to it through the 10th Amendment. But the state has the powers to determine the education for its citizens. It gets to determine marriage licensing, other sorts of certificate licensing, such as driver's licenses. Each state can kind of manipulate what the national standard is. So, for example, marriage in Indiana, you can be 16, and with parental permission, you can get married. In West Virginia, you can be 14. In Indiana, up until 4 months ago, we didn't allow same-sex marriage, but Iowa allowed it up to a year prior. Indiana allows first cousins to get married. So each state kind of has its own weird idiosyncrasies. But that licensing also includes, like, let's say, a plumber's license or a teacher's licensing or a doctor's licensing. So each state has certain requirements. Now, it is transferable. So if I move to California, then I can be a teacher in California, but I'll probably have to get my license updated, which means I might have to do some special things just for California licensing. And then at the local level, what we see is the local government is usually in charge of like protection. And what we mean by that is both police and fire. It would be illogical if the national government was responsible for fire protection, right? We have local firehouses that protect neighborhoods, and that's kind of the responsibility. Local governments are also responsible for local roads. They're responsible for initiating what the state requires as far as education, but each school can kind of do it its own way. So Lawrence Township, even though the state mandates certain testing, Lawrence Township can kind of maneuver within that kind of the parameters that the state gives it. Lawrence Township runs school as Lawrence Township sees fit. Hamilton Southeastern Schools, they run it their way. Our IPS runs it their way. So something to kind of keep in mind there. Moving on, we have the next one is separation of powers. And what we have with separation of powers is that no one branch holds too much power. So we can see we have legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, and each one has certain responsibilities. The legislative branch makes the laws, the executive branch carries out or enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the laws. So it's really important to understand that each one has a specific role within the government. Now, if we look specifically at the legislative branch, and you can kind of see, and I don't need to go through all of these, but it's organized by two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate, every state gets 2 senators, and the House of Representatives, delegates or representatives come from each state based upon the size of the population. Every state is guaranteed at least 1 representative. So states like South Dakota, they have 2 senators and 1 representative. The legislative branch makes laws. They appropriate money, meaning so if they pass a law saying they're going to fix the bridges, I don't know if you've read recently that 70% of the nation's bridges are deemed to be unsafe. So it would be up to the legislative branch to pass a bill that would appropriate money to fix those bridges. The legislative branch regulates immigration or establishes post offices or declares war. So there's a lot of things that the legislative branch is responsible for. The executive branch, all the power resides within the President of the United States. Now, the President takes on a bunch of different roles. Now, these are only 4 of the 7, but as chief executive, it's the President's responsibility to kind of set the course of where we're going. As chief of state, he's the representative that when he plays the role of chief of state and meets a foreign leader, then he represents the United States in any of those meetings. As chief legislator, one of the things that the president does is to actually push legislation. We saw this with President Obama when he was running to be president in 2007, 2008. One of the big things that he pushed was affordable care. And so he believed strongly that everybody had that same opportunity to get insurance and health care. And so he can't write the laws, but what he can do is he can kind of persuade members of the legislative branch, specifically the House and the Senate, to write legislation and get it passed. And then lastly, what we get is, as commander-in-chief, once the legislative branch declares war, it's up to the president as commander-in-chief to then carry out that directive. So when President Bush decided, with advisors and through Congress, decided to invade Afghanistan and Iraq in 2003 and 4 and 5 and 6, and it was under his leadership that we embarked upon that conflict. And lastly, then we have the judicial branch. The judicial branch then is represented by the Supreme Court, but there are also other federal courts, which we'll talk about when we get into Unit 5. The responsibility of the judicial branch is to preserve and protect the rights guaranteed by the Constitution. You know, the Supreme Court has the ability to look at acts of the government or laws of the government that the legislative branch passes or that the executive branch carries out and deem them to be unconstitutional. They can determine that, you know, the act of what's a recent act that's been declared unconstitutional? Anyway, I'm fading, but anyway, they can do that. They can only consider cases involving national laws, but they can then consider state laws when it is when ultimately the establishment of that state law will conflict with a national law. So the 5th one is checks and balances. I'm going to kind of hurry up here. I lost it. It prevents the abuse of power in government. Each branch can check the power of every other branch. Some of the checks includes like vetoing laws, things like that, legislative checks, overriding the president's veto, you can look at all that, and judicial checks are, of course, declaring something unconstitutional. And then lastly is judicial review, and this is really a tough one to kind of comprehend, but understand this. It's the power of the court to determine the constitutionality of a government action, right? We've already talked about this a lot, but this was one that wasn't necessarily within the Constitution, and it had to be carved out by the Supreme Court.